whose idea was we've got too many farmers, let's get rid of them. And the second one was a fairly venerable economist who used to write for the Sunday Mail called H.W. Herbert. Some of the older people here just might remember him. He'd been a farmer and then he became an economist. He had some good ideas. But I got up to speak, and all of a sudden, out of that management committee, a guy got up and ripped into me. This is absolute nonsense, talking about funny money and producing money and using our own credit. He said, we've been through all this in the Depression, it's a load of rubbish, and this guy's talking funny money. And I got all hot under the collar and I swore at him, and it ended up in a great battle. And finally the chairman, whose name was Bob Sparks, I don't know if anybody remembers that name, called a halt and said, we better have lunch and cool off. Fair enough. But the guy who'd attacked me, when the room had cleared, came across to me and said, come and have a beer with me. We walked out of the hotel, which was in George Street, went across to a bar, and we had a beer and sat down. And he said, of course, you're absolutely right, you know. But you know as well as I do what would happen if we picked this up. We'd lose, I mean, look at the overdraft our party has got. Look at the donations that we expect from the big companies. All that would dry up. We wouldn't win the next election. Now, he happened to be the Federal Minister for Agriculture, and his name was Charlie Adderman. And not only was he a politician, but he gave a Sunday school, 1-hour broadcast from Kingaroy every week, and he did that for 50 years, on standing for the truth and all that stuff. So we went back at 2 o'clock, and this guy who told me I was right got up and attacked me again. Oh, funny money, we can't have any of that rubbish. By that time I was pretty speechless. He then retired from Parliament and got a knighthood, and I was producing a newspaper in the rural areas of Queensland called Queensland Calling, and he agreed to become the patron of it. And he wrote some good articles on money. Once he'd got out, he'd got his pension and was out of the battle, he was prepared to tell the truth. So it's not a question of logic. It's a question of huge power movements. And I want to tell you some of the things that are important about that. You might remember the last election when One Nation stood for office in Canberra. They put forward a suggestion that they ought to produce a bank to finance small business and farmers in Australia to the tune of $150 million. And that was as though a bomb went off. And on the 7:30 report that night, the Treasurer of Australia sat down very seriously, Peter Costello, and said, this is absolute danger. If we start creating money to finance people, we're going to end up in Germany with wheelbarrows of marks that would only buy you a loaf of bread. And he said, this has been peddled round Australia by odd conspiracy theorists. And he held up a newsletter which I had written 20 years ago that night about how we could use our own money in Australia to get our own sovereignty back. He didn't tell anybody where it came from or who wrote it, but you were supposed to get the message. This was thoroughly dangerous. Okay. We're celebrating the centenary of Federation this year. And 100 years ago, Australia became a nation with its own flag and its own central parliament, and all the states handed some power in, and we became what is today the Commonwealth of Australia. At the time it happened, we had the highest standard of living in the world, which was a brilliant achievement, because only 100 years previous to that, or a little over 100 years, the first settlers had arrived at Botany Bay in ancient creaky sailing ships, and over 1/3 of those who arrived in the first fleet as convicts died either in the journey or in the harbour after the ships landed. And they just took the dead bodies and tipped them over the side in Botany Bay. And the doctor records in his diary, if you want to read the story, we saw white naked bodies lying on the rocks all around the harbour. There wasn't a building, there wasn't a road, there wasn't a map. Nobody knew what lay inside this country. They had a few chooks and they had a few seeds, and that was about it. And within 100 years, or just about over 100 years, we were the highest standard of living in the world. Nothing like it has ever been done before. And all this stuff about Australians cringing and not being proud of their culture is rubbish, because what we did was brilliant. We opened up the whole of this area. We had